If you have not already, please do fill out the conference eval, which will be appearing in the chat box at some point, I'm sure. Um, we will be doing breakout rooms for the next two sessions because they are going to be concurrent with one another. So we need to, sorry, having some issues here with the control. Um, so we're going to have breakout rooms as the session rooms. So if you have not already, then we need you to update your Zoom. I'm trying to bring up the directions to do that, and they're not showing up for me. But we just need to make sure that you have the latest Zoom version going so that you can join us. If you do not see breakout rooms available when we go to that, then please just chat in the box and request which room you would like to be put in, and you'll be put in that room. At any point in time, the breakout room tab down there at the bottom of the screen, we're here with the little four squares. If I'm in the middle of a presentation in the monitoring session and you're like, man, this guy is boring, what's Lisa got going on in microrizing and want to jump, feel free to do that. You can go back and forth between the breakout rooms. But the breakout rooms, or excuse me, the sessions will be recorded so that in theory you can watch the other one later once we get to that point. So for now, I think that's all of the logistical information you'll need. And just choose a breakout room that you would like to go to for your session, either monitoring or mycorrhizae, and we will go on from there. So all you monitoring types, I will see you in the monitoring room. All right, give people a couple of minutes to make sure they're logged in here. Looks like we've got 16 people yet to be moved to a room, so we'll give it another couple of minutes and then dive in to our monitoring workshop. Now, we'll note for people that this one we're going to be doing a little differently than the actual conference. If you've been with us for that or most of it, this will be a mixture of live and recorded, but still time for question and answer and sharing between those things. Looks like we're almost there. Nine people unassigned. If anybody wants to turn their mic on and tell the joke, feel free.
You serious, Ben?
Go for it, Mark.
It's like a half-hour joke, though.
Okay, maybe not.
All right, I'm back on mute.
right. Well, I feel like these people will filter in for the meat of it. So we have a lot of material to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and get going with the intro and take off from there. So kind of the impetus for this workshop was an APHIS funded workshop series that we did looking at southwestern willow flycatcher riparian habitat and how to improve that. Did a couple of virtual workshops this past fall. Those are available on our website. You can just go onto our Tamara's Beetle page and you'll see workshops and you can access the presentations from those. But that really started a discussion about monitoring in the lower Colorado basin, especially because of the movement of the beetle, and that there's a lot of people with projects do monitoring for vegetation response and such, but that there really is a need to monitor across all different taxa, whether it be for insects, in this case the Tamara's beetle is what we were focusing on, or birds, or vegetation, what's going on with the hydrology. There's all kind of things that need to be monitored. And so a conversation was generated about what that looks like, what that's going to look like in the future. And of course, a big part of that is funding. So we'll talk a little bit about funding today. If you're planning on hanging on till the end to find out exactly the key to fund all your monitoring from now on, you might as well hop off now because we don't have that answer for you. But we will have, I think, some good options. We spoke to some of the kind of higher level funders like the Walton Family Foundation and the Bonneville to try to see how they go about deciding what to fund. And so we have some insight from people that might fund your projects that we'll be providing. But the general kind of agenda as we have it laid out is to start first talking about monitoring design. Mark's going to get into some of the lessons learned, do's and don'ts. There's so many good ways to do it, but also lots of bad ways. So Mark's going to touch on that, and then we're also going to kind of break down different monitoring types and kind of what that design looks like and where you should go from there. We will have a little bit of Q&A between each of these, probably keep it moving along because we do have so much data to cover, but then we have plenty of time at the end. We can stay all night if you want to. I mean, it's light now, so it's not like I can go to sleep after this. So we're going to go ahead and hop in. I'm assuming, Mark, am I passing it over to you, or did
or I can share my screen, then whatever is easier.
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure if you'd uploaded a presentation I need to just play, or if you got it.
No, I'm coming at you live.
All right, perfect. Well, take it away.
All right. Can you see it?
Yep.
All right. We're off to a good start. Well, hello, everybody. Great to be with you here in the last end of our virtual conference, and really happy to be part of this workshop. Ben, thanks for organizing it. We've got a really great lineup. I'm actually looking forward to hearing other presentations as well. This one, as Ben mentioned, is the title of his 10 Considerations for a Robust Monitoring Program. And sure here. And what I aim to do is talk about considerations for, as you develop a monitoring program, and maybe even in the space that I have, the 20 minutes, is make you a monitoring zealot if you aren't one already. Probably most on this workshop are already, but those are my two objectives. I wanted to give credit where credit's due. A lot of the thoughts and points that I'm making in this presentation come from this recently published guidebook on stream restoration. In particular, chapter 7 of the guidebook is on monitoring results of stream corridor restoration. Daniel Bunting, the lead author on that chapter from Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of really great authors, good mix of scientists, practitioners from Australia, excuse me, Mexico and the US. So it's a great chapter put together. Anyway, a lot of the thoughts come from this great mix of authors here. Before getting into the consideration and my soapbox on becoming a zealot, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page what we mean by what exactly is when we say monitoring, what we're talking about in the context of this workshop, of this presentation anyway. And what we're talking about is in terms of monitoring is we're talking about outcome or effectiveness monitoring, particularly in the context of stream restoration results. More specifically, I'm discussing here is a question-driven, science-based approach that tracks and documents the success of stream restoration projects over time. And if we add the word robust to the mix of robust monitoring, what we're trying to get across here is a monitoring program where you are collecting data in a thoughtful, systematic way that provides a basis for analysis, where you can interpret, where your interpretation allows for the quantification of stream restoration success, laying the basis for effective adaptive management. So becoming a zealot, couple thoughts I wanted to make before I get into the 10 considerations concern at least why monitor. And the first one and the first couple are pretty obvious, but it's we as stream restoration practitioners, whatever part of it that you are doing in your professional life, we're constantly doing projects where we are attempting to move the condition needle from empty to full, or from undesirable ecologic conditions to more desirable. And we need to know where we are in that scale. And that is in a sense, the foundation of monitoring, is to allow us to know just how well we are pushing that needle. And then that in turn allows the basis for adaptive management. So if you're conducting some type of stream restoration project, it allows you to know whether it's effective. If it isn't effective, it allows you to tweak some of the tactics that you're putting together so that they will be more effective. For funders out there, maybe even on this in this workshop, if you are a funder and you're not requiring monitoring, what you are essentially telling recipients of the funding is that you don't really need to know results in any great detail. Conversely, if you are a recipient of funding and you're putting together, based on some funding, stream restoration tactics, and you're not monitoring, that means you have little understanding of how well your restoration project is realizing its objectives and the extent that you move the needle. So if your river or stream is in a deteriorated condition, and you want to push it toward wild or natural, where are you along that spectrum? That's your bottom line. And if you don't have that information, again, like I said earlier, you have little foundation for adaptive management and how you might be able to change your restoration tactics to achieve more desirable, to be more effective and achieve more desirable results. The other part of promoting monitoring, if you will, is just from a global standpoint. If you think about just globally, the tens of thousands of stream restoration projects that have been done over the years, hundreds of thousands. The lack of monitoring really represents a dramatic loss of knowledge. I mean, it is a real shame that not only, when a lot of these projects are not monitored, we don't know exactly what was achieved, but the lessons learned are sometimes lost because of lack of monitoring for the benefit of future restoration efforts. So me and Yosemite Sam here are urging everybody to monitor. That's my big soapbox for getting into the 10 considerations. The other thing I wanted to say too, just before getting into the 10 considerations of monitoring, is that when we talk about robust monitoring, it doesn't mean we're talking about oodles of money. Certainly some of the considerations that I'm going to be discussing here will cost something. They'll be more than going out and just taking a few pictures or just writing some sort of descriptive report. I mean, they do cost something, but it doesn't mean that you need a war chest. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, into the top 10 considerations for monitoring that we outlined in the guidebook chapter. I put 1 and 2 together, considerations 1 and 2 together, because they deal, of course, with monitoring, but they also deal with the restoration, your objectives of your restoration, stream restoration program themselves. So the first one is monitoring. Your monitoring objectives need to be solidly based on your stream restoration or conservation objectives. And 2, your stream restoration objectives in and of themselves need to be quantifiable. And so those two kind of go hand in hand. And let me give you a quick example of this. If your stated stream restoration objective, say you're on a creek called Riplog Creek, and your objective goes no more than saying you want to establish native riparian trees along it, you could, if you planted 1,000 trees and you got 5 that happened to survive, you could claim victory. I mean, your objective is not quantifiable. Conversely, maybe all 1,000 survived, and gives you, credence to jump up and down with victory. But again, because your objective has no quantification into it, you have little way to understand just how well you're moving that needle, no matter how well done your monitoring is. Conversely, if your stated objective along Riplog Creek is to establish 220 native riparian trees per hectare along 5 kilometers of it, that gives you something to sink your teeth into quantifiably, and allows you to gauge your monitoring program around that. So you can really understand where you are today. So today, maybe you're just planting the trees and you hope that tomorrow you're going to be somewhere between the goal, which is 220 trees per hectare, and the 0 trees that you have now. So that's the idea. So for the first 2 considerations deal directly with tying your monitoring program directly to the objectives of your stream restoration program, and making sure your stream restoration program those objectives are quantifiable. Consideration number 3, make sure to include monitoring in the planning phase of your project. And so as you begin to plan, I mean, don't think of monitoring as some kind of extra accoutrement that you can just sort of add on there, maybe if you have a few extra cents. We're going to get into funding monitoring a little bit later on in the workshop, but monitoring is part of implementation. That's the way it should be considered. You get a program or a budget for doing stream restoration. Monitoring is part of it. Don't go with your tin cup to a funder and try to plead for monitoring. It should be automatic. 15% of the budget or whatever you think is appropriate should be automatically set aside. It is part of implementation. And we'll get into a little bit more of convincing funders who may be not so amenable to monitoring a little bit later on. Consideration number 4, initiate monitoring prior to implementing stream restoration tactics or your stream conservation measures, whatever your management program is. This is kind of an obvious one, but it's amazing how sometimes implementation of on the ground actions can get out ahead of monitoring. And so I put a couple examples here, or the example here is from some work along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo that dealt with trying to knock back giant cane, And so you can see in the picture above here, veg monitoring is being conducted in thick veg before management actions occurred. Second picture, is a prescribed burn of giant cane. You can see a big dense stand of giant cane there, and the treatment that happened afterwards, and then post-treatment monitoring that occurred following the treatment several months later. And so consideration number 4, initiate monitoring prior to the implementation of stream conservation measures. Consideration number 5, try to establish control sites if you can. This is sometimes easier said than done, and it may not be appropriate in all situations, but control sites are essentially sites of similar biophysical conditions to where you are implementing your restoration tactics or your management actions, but sites where the management actions in themselves are not taking place. And so they have the as close to mirrored biophysical conditions, but without the management actions, and it allows you direct comparison between sites where management actions occurred and those were not, to really gauge the effectiveness of those restoration tactics or management actions. Consideration number 6, for the monitoring program, try to connect the biophysical dots. So what I mean by that is you are trying to provide the environmental context for the restoration results that you achieve. So like, for example, if going back to our made up example on Riplog Creek here, if you only had 10 trees out of 1,000 trees that were planted that survived, the question that you're going to be asking yourself, and the funders too probably, is why? Why was the percent survival so low? And so the point I'm trying to make here with consideration number 6 is to include other types of data and monitoring that deal with the biophysical context of the stream where your restoration project is taking place. So for example, weather stations nearby. Maybe precip was really low and you planted your trees during a period of where the temperature is really high and the precip were really low, and it was essentially drought conditions, and that's why you had such low survival. Or maybe you had a high magnitude flood occurring a couple of weeks after you planted. This could be data collected from nearby stream gauges. It could be just anecdotal data provided by people who live near the creek, but that'll be critical to know. Shallow groundwater depths. Maybe the shallow groundwater dropped below the root systems of your newly planted establishing trees. And so that'll be good to know. And so that's sort of the context of getting at the why. And it's also important to note that gathering this kind of environmental data and information that provides that context, it doesn't mean that you're adding tremendously to your budget, to your money budget. You can be getting a lot of this data and information free of charge from weather stations, stream gauges, anecdotal information for people who live nearby. Even if you go to the length of installing your own piezometers, it doesn't have to be a big deal in terms of cost. It can be something done quite inexpensively. Consideration number 7 deals with ecosystem services. And again, this is maybe one of those considerations that may not be possible for all stream restoration projects, but man, if you can include monitoring ecoservices along with monitoring biophysical conditions along with your project, you would be really golden and maybe even set up greater for fundraising. So just imagine that you got with on the bottom there your stream restoration project implemented, and you're conducting some monitoring, which allows you insight to both the impacts of stream restoration on the biophysical and chemical condition of your stream, but also socioeconomic impacts. So for example, what does restoration might benefit birding along the Santa Cruz River in Tucson? We did a project with ranchers in a hilo called Miguel Hidalgo in Sonora, Mexico, where we installed, they installed a bunch of gabions that allowed sediment accumulation and water accumulation in many of the streams that their cattle grazed in. And so that had a huge socioeconomic benefit to them. Engaging that was huge for us to continue that project and expand it. Consideration 8, we'll get into this later. Bruce Orr will talk a little bit about this, but the technology, remote sensing technology over the last decade, and I don't mean, and all of you on this call probably know this, and maybe even involved in it, has grown tremendously, and using it and taking advantage of it can be really key to understanding what's going on with your restoration site or sites, and the impacts that you achieve with your restoration actions. I'm a big fan of complementing, on the ground monitoring with remote sensing, and I think the two together really can give you both kind of a high level understanding of the impacts of restoration, as well as on the ground, a little bit more detail. Number 9, as you develop your restoration monitoring program, know that help is there. I mean, the restoration practitioner community, certainly there's many of us, everybody in this workshop, and probably many of you on this call have huge experience with developing monitoring programs and protocols. And so for those of you that are just, starting out and maybe developing a monitoring system for your stream restoration program, reach out to the restoration practitioner community can provide huge benefits. Academia, of course, we involved statisticians, other folks, professors and whatnot, and students in our monitoring effort, and that has been a great help for a lot of the monitoring we've done in many of the regions that I've worked in. And then certainly in terms of potentially in terms of implementing your monitoring program involving citizen science and students can be a great benefit. And if you can even train them, they can become sort of the go-to team for implementing your monitoring protocols. And last but and not least, consideration number 10, don't reinvent the wheel there in terms of the protocols. By protocols, I mean everything from the, where your data collection is going to take place, to how you're actually going to do it, to the timing, everything in between. Most of the monitoring work that has been done, no matter whether you're monitoring fish, vegetation, morphology, channel morphology, birds, ecosystem services, stream flow, water quality, protocols are out there. Many of it has been done before numerous times. And so don't reinvent the wheel. It's out there. You'll need to adapt it to your own situation, but you don't need to start from scratch. Okay. Well, thank you much for this. And I think we might, Ben, we might have some time for a few questions maybe, or screams.
Sure, go for it.
Should I just check the chat box here or what?
Anybody? Bueller? Huh, I guess you just explained it really well. So you want to move on, and since you've got the next one, if some questions come in, we can just tackle them in as well. So
okay, sounds good. All right. All right, you just saw my my presentation backwards. Okay, so Ben, I'm moving on then, huh? I'm going to
go for it.
All right, I will go for it. Okay, so the next part of our workshop is going on to, this is the part where we start talking about monitoring specific parts of the stream ecosystem, I guess I might say, and my talk here is on monitoring riparian plant communities. And so I'm gonna talk about specifically riparian vegetation and monitoring riparian vegetation. And again, as I said before, the context here is on, in the context of conducting stream riparian restoration projects, engaging success. That's what we're talking about in terms of monitoring riparian. And really I want to underscore that these are kind of food for thoughts and considerations. I'm not trying to advocate any particular monitoring approach. It's just kind of putting some ideas out there that I've learned and folks other folks have learned, and just sort of food for thought as you think about your own riparian monitoring, vegetation monitoring program. Oh, and again, like I mentioned in the earlier talk 2 minutes ago, is that this talk on monitoring riparian vegetation comes out of the guidebook in the same chapter. So if you want to get into some of the nuances here, we also discuss channel morphology, monitoring groundwater and stream flow and the like as well in this chapter. But if you're interested, you can just Google renewing our rivers, and you'll get to the guidebook, and this chapter is on it. So in terms of monitoring riparian veg and really other types of monitoring as well, first things first is you need to finalize the objectives of your monitoring program, and this is one of those great discussions to have with your stream restoration team, is to sort of sit down and say, okay, what are our essential questions for monitoring? Don't make a laundry list, 2 or 3 will do, but it's really important to get your heads around. It might be completely obvious, but it's important that everybody kind of talks about it and agrees to it from the start, so that when you develop your protocols, they're centered around what the essential questions are. I'll give you an example, taking you back to an example I presented before. I worked for numerous years along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, between Chihuahua, Coahuila, and West Texas. And we did a lot of things along the river. Amongst them, along about 250 kilometers of river was choked by or becoming choked by Arundo. And so our binational team, one of the aspects of our restoration response was to tackle head-on Arundo. And here are the questions that we agreed on that were central to the monitoring program that we developed around our managing of giant cane. One was simply, are treatment methods effective? I mean, did they actually knock back giant cane? And the second was, what was the response of the riparian plant community after giant cane was removed? Did giant cane come roaring back? Did other non-natives come in? Was there a mix of non-natives and native species? And so those were our 2 questions that we agreed on, just as an example. The other thing that I mentioned earlier, but want to emphasize here too, is monitoring riparian plant vegetation as well as other types of monitoring programs. They have a great, historic track record, and there's a lot of great protocols out there that you can choose from. I gave you this Perkins et al. So-called big river monitoring programs as an example, which is one of the programs, protocols that we use and adapted to our work along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, just as an example. But you're gonna, it's a challenge, because, and in part because there's so many good protocols that are out there, and the challenge that you'll have is selecting one that's best suited to your unique situation and adapting it to your unique situation. And so that's really one of the challenges that you will have, but you'll certainly give you a great head start. So some thoughts on setting up riparian vegetation monitoring. I'll start with the where, as in where the monitoring, determining where the monitoring well will occur. And I'll just continue with this example along the Big Bend reach of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. This was, again, about 250 kilometers. And what we ended up doing was establishing monitoring sites, which are indicated here by these little red circles, along various parts of the river where we were doing restoration actions. And what we use is a mix of random establishment procedures combined with common sense and expert opinion. So, for example, you can randomly assign various sites to various parts of the river, but then you might be adjusting these sites, which we did for practical reasons of, access, for example, was always a big one. You didn't want a site that was so remote that you'll never get to it unless you had, really a lot of funding in a given year. We also, in this particular reach of the river, went through canyon country and alluvial valleys. And so we wanted a sort of equal mix of alluvial reaches and canyon reaches. And so there's a variety of things that you can do to establish where your sites are. And you're the expert, and you really, not that you can't go wrong, but there's a lot of ways to do it correctly. So within each of those, within each of these little sites here, what we did, and again, this is, food for thought. I'm not trying to promote anything here, and you can do it. There's a lot of ways that you can be doing this, but within each of those monitoring sites, we had a mix of transects and plots. What we did was establish transects that lined up perpendicular from the river about along, about 150 meters or so. They were equidistant laid out upstream and downstream. And we had, in our case, we used about 10 transects. And then we established plots along those transects randomly. And the plots were essentially, we didn't measure data per se along transects. All the data that we measured were from the plots that were randomly established along the transects. In other words, the transects were used as a way to establish where the plots were located. If you look at it like a specific, so if you look at, let me just go back here. If you look at just say one of these transects here, like this one here, doesn't really matter, but here's sort of an idealized cross-channel profile of a stream system. And so our transect essentially went from water's edge to the end of the active bottomland environment, and encompassed potentially emergent zone, floodplain areas, terrace, and stopped at abandoned terrace. And then what we did within those is then we mapped, essentially located where these different surfaces were, floodplain versus terrace, abandoned terrace, or maybe floodplain, primary floodplains versus secondary, whatever was important for our monitoring questions. And then what we did was randomly establish plots in based on each of these channel morphologic surfaces. So you end up with a stratified random sampling design, which to us, at least for the questions, the monitoring questions that we had, made lots of sense. The what I'm measuring, as in terms of what parameters to measure, it's an important question to ask, because sometimes you sort of default into, need to measure everything. Do you need to measure perennials and excuse me, and all annuals? Do you need to measure percent cover and density and diversity? So what is it that you need to do to answer the questions that you put forth? In our situation, we just measured percent cover. We felt that was fine for answering the questions that we had. And we did measure everything that fell within the plot, meaning perennials, annuals, and anything that we found within the plot. But it's an important question to ask. I mean, do you really need to do that? Do you need to really measure annuals as part of answering your questions? Because it can be time consuming. And if you can get away with just measuring woodies, so much the better. Thoughts on plot size. we found that using larger numbers of small size plots, in our case, we use 1 square meter plots, was more effective in our situation than using like a smaller quantity of larger plot sizes. So, you know, in this situation, like I just described, you had 10 transects with small plots along each of these transects, say, versus a situation where you're trying to establish really large plots. And I've seen some monitoring programs that have these large oval 50-meter radius or maybe diameter plots, and they're really large. And the challenge that you run into with such plot size, say, as opposed to this, which is what I just described, is what we were using along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, where you have, you know, a bunch of small 1 square meter plots along your transect established, versus say something like this, where you have this sort of what's depicted here as a, you know, the flying saucer, something, but it could be the, you know, a really large plot that is like 50 meters in diameter or something like that. But what you, the challenge that you run into in these kind of situations is you end up measuring potentially plant communities or even ecosystem types that you don't want to. So in this situation, you may not want to measure the vegetation on an abandoned terrace, and you may want to just have your plot just measuring the active bottomline land environment. And conversely, if your large plot randomly established ends up sticking into the water, that also could be a problem, because you end up with that apples, oranges, or maybe more importantly, apples to bowling balls or something like that kind of comparison, where you're collecting data that just doesn't make sense to mix. And so the other practical consequence of this too is that oftentimes your floodplain, you know, along some of the stream systems that I've monitored, is really narrow and can only accommodate small plots. And so if you have a 50-meter plot, they could easily stick out and just, you know, won't be accommodated in your riparian zone. Let's see. Oh, the other practical reason for having that we ended up changing also to small plots versus larger. Here's our one square meter plot here. You can see the flag that's in the middle of it that was randomly established, but you can get it into the dense vegetation that you need to. I mean, imagine tromping through a bunch of baccharis and arundo. You know, if your plot is 20 meters long, it becomes ridiculously difficult. Thoughts on plot permanence. This is another thing that we ran into early on in our monitoring program in several situations. The question here is, do you permanently fix plots to an exact, you know, the same piece of ground for repeated measurement, or do you not? If you it makes sense. I mean, there's, you know, a strong argument can be made, particularly statistically, to measuring the same exact piece of ground over and over again. The problem that you run into, particularly in stream environments, is that they're so dynamic, and we found that it made a lot of sense not to try to refine plots, the same exact plot every year. I mean, here's a great example. Here's an acacia in one of our, you know, up in the surface behind her, you know, you can imagine this is an acacia, so it's not right on a primary floodplain surface. So this is an upper floodplain surface, but you can look at the debris here. So this, even though this is a, you know, higher elevated surface, it still gets flooding. And our, our monitoring plot was right here, buried underneath, a bunch of sediment there. And if you had to find these plots every year, or whatever your monitoring frequency is, it involves, you know, hunting and pecking for them. Some of them are scoured downstream, or you have to resurvey them, or you're going to be bringing in metal detectors. I mean, it can get, like I said, it can get ridiculously difficult to try to do it that way. So the way we did it was to monument the end of our transects, or the beginning, whichever way you want to look at it. So the area, the transect, the end of the part of the transect where you're on a surface that's not inundated, affected by stream flow routinely. And we monument that, of course, survey that in. And then we take a bearing from there and along with a description. And so every time that we monitor, what essentially we do is we go to that same transect, we have the bearing, and then we go and reestablish newly randomly established plots along the different surfaces that are found along that terrace. And we redo it every year. And we found that even though you're kind of starting, I wouldn't say from scratch, but you're that it doesn't take much time at all. I mean, once you get the hang of it, you can set these transects up fairly quickly. And here's one of our monumented transects, just to give you an example. So well above active floodplain environment outside. I mean, if this monument gets flooded out, the world is ended, and so it wouldn't matter anyway. And so so this is a monument at the end of our transect, and down here is where the transect essentially started and went to water's edge. Thoughts on monitoring schedule. This is the win of monitoring. I mentioned before, and it's important to say it again, but of course the before and after is really important, as to sort of make sure to begin monitoring before your management action or restoration action has been conducted on the ground. And this involved, like, for example, in the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, us getting some pretty thick vegetation. I showed this photograph before, but this is pretty typical of what our pre-vegetation conditions are like, and always a lot of fun, and makes you hate vegetation with thorns on it. But anyway, getting there before is really critical. And then, in terms of the before and after, discussing with your restoration team what after means, and really stressing long-term that what you're talking about here in terms of what, how far in the future monitoring should continue is usually well after your grant, the life of your, specific grant, or your maybe your one-time restoration program. You want to really get going on thinking about the long-term, decadal at the very least, because that's what it takes to really understand the effectiveness of stream restorations. 1 or 2 years of monitoring doesn't do that. It has to be at least 10 years. And so really getting that across and trying to understand, what a monitoring schedule might mean in the context of monitoring for 10 years is a really critical conversation to have with your restoration team. And then from there, say, okay, we're going to monitor 10 years, 15 years. What would be a realistic long-term schedule? And so just as an example, and using the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo monitoring that we did as an example, we surveyed at least once every 3 years. So following the completion of restoration actions. So we have various sites on at a 3-year cycle, and that worked for us. But you in your own monitoring program will need to come up with a schedule that's realistic for yourselves. And then, excuse me, consider greater frequency of monitoring immediately following a management action. So for example, when we conducted the treatment of Arundo along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, what we did is, we did the prescribed burn, and then treated resprouts with herbicide, 6 weeks or so later. And then several months after that, really almost as soon as we could, we got in there and did our first round of monitoring. And then following that, we put it on a 3-year cycle. And so, have that inherent flexibility in there based on your management actions really made a lot of sense. And then incorporate inherent flexibility in the monitoring schedule to accommodate various biophysical triggers is also really important. So flooding is a perfect example. So you have your, if you have your monitoring schedule on a 1 to 3 year cycle, you're going back to sites, it's really important to also have that inherent flexibility so that when a large flood comes of sufficient duration to really rework the bottomland environment, that you kind of get with your team and see if you can go back and do monitoring maybe at a greater frequency that allows you to get in, say, for example, after a large flood event. And establishing sort of what constitutes a large flood event, or what, flood event, and what might be a trigger is actually, it could be relatively easy. It could be just a discussion saying, okay, we're going to monitor this transect or this site every 3 years from, after management actions. But if a flood occurs that covers the floodplain terrace, of these sites, and so it's enough magnitude to cover both the floodplain and the terrace, and is of sufficient duration to really rework the sediment and maybe scour significant parts of the environment, and you can gauge that after a flood and just go back and look, then we are going to get out and monitor the sites that were affected as soon as possible. So having that sort of biophysical trigger in there, along with the sort of the programmatic, 1 every 3 years, is really important. So you can begin to kind of understand not only the consequences of your management actions or your restoration actions on the riparian plant community, but also what might have been the consequences of a flood, using this example, on your riparian plant community as well. And I mentioned biophysical triggers. The bio part of it could be, the presence or arrival of a bio control agent like the salt cedar leaf beetle. I mean, that is a perfect example. You're monitoring away after doing your restoration actions once every 3 years, and then suddenly the salt cedar leaf beetle arrives, and that might be a good trigger for you and your team to go back and say, okay, how does this affect the 1 to 3 year frequency of our monitoring actions? And I think that's it for my riparian veg part, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for letting me chat here.
All right, thanks, Mark. We have any questions? And I'm thinking in this size group, if you just want to unmute yourself and ask, I think that'd be fine.
And I'm going to stop sharing here since, right?
So any questions or? All right then.
I have a question, Ben.
Go ahead.
Mark, have you run into any problems with your statistical analyses? Just because of inability to have randomly located sites, things like that?
Yeah, Cynthia, we have.
Yeah.
I need to go into details. One thing that happened to us was 15 years ago. I mean, just using this Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. When we started 15 years ago, we started actually using these longer plots that were 2 meters by 20, and it just wasn't working out. We statistically, it didn't give us the numbers that we wanted, and then from a practical standpoint, a lot of times the channel would change so much that we also were trying to permanently locate them, that they would begin, the orientation of the plot would, where it once was, say, on a primary floodplain, it would stick halfway in the river, the next year that you're out there measuring. And so we changed midstream, so to speak, to the design that I was sort of talking about, that involved, a lot of smaller sites and doing it every year, not permanently locating them. And that involved us that was beyond my pay grade from a statistics standpoint. And so fortunately, we had someone who was working with us, who professor at Wesleyan of all places, but she had roots in along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo area, and so she was a statistician, and so we were able to work that out. But I mean, that's a long answer to say yes. And I would say, in that context, I think that happens a lot. And from an ideal standpoint, of course, you want to set up your monitoring program so that the methods that you have are the same from one year to the next and everything. That's ideal, and of course, that's what you want. But from my experience, that is rare. You often have to tweak them for whatever reason, and so knowing that is good, I think. And then knowing that statistically, unless it's completely changed program, there's ways around it that can be addressed and still allows you to collect valuable data that will give you really good information.
Yeah, good. Thanks. That's helpful.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else, or should we hop into Rob's presentation? All right. I guess we'll dive right in. So our next presentation is from Rob Toms, not Thomas, for all you Matchbox 20 fans out there. I was like, oh. But he is a scientist from Stillwater Sciences, who are a great sponsor and participant in our conference every year. And Bruce Orr, who's going to be presenting after him as well, is going to be fielding any questions you may have related to this presentation. So let's hop on into the use of drones.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining the monitoring workshop. I'm an ecologist with Stillwater Sciences. I'm based in our Berkeley, California office, so you'll hear me refer to projects near me. After just hearing about the importance of monitoring and developing how to develop a monitoring plan, I'm going to talk about some advances in monitoring made possible by novel technologies, specifically unmanned aerial systems, UASs, sometimes also called UAVs or drones. Stillwater has applied UAS technology to vegetation and habitat monitoring, to invasive plant monitoring, mitigation success monitoring, restoration engineering design planning, and geomorphic monitoring. I'm a plant guy, so that's mostly what you're going to hear me talk about today, but I will have a couple case studies related to the engineering design and geomorphic monitoring. So there are a few key benefits to using UASs for monitoring. First and foremost is accessibility and efficiency. UASs can cover large territories pretty quickly, regardless of conditions on the ground. You may also want to use UASs because existing imagery that you have access to may be inadequate for whatever reason. Insufficient resolution, may not be current, or might be taken at the wrong time of year for how you want to analyze it. UAS flights are easily repeatable. A programmed flight path can be repeated for comparison over time, unlimited number of times. And using UASs can reduce field crew impact to potentially sensitive habitats, and also reduce potential spread of invasive plants. So based on a given project's data goals and budget and needs, we have a few different approaches we use to collect imagery for monitoring in the field. And the first approach involves subsampling by collecting imagery either at specific points or subsampling the area in plots. This approach both requires the use of other base imagery, which is no doubt going to be less refined than something you could collect with a UAS, in order to supplement the newly collected high-resolution imagery. There are areas you'll select, whether it's points or the plots, and then based on the data gathered there, extrapolate onto the imagery that you do have available. The points can be very budget friendly. It requires no post-processing, but definitely comes with a loss to product utility because of the data confidence from extrapolation. The other subsampling approach, plots, we would fly within that plot to collect imagery for the entire plot and then use field truth data from within that to extrapolate onto the rest of the area. This does require post-processing, but increases the quality of the data significantly. And then finally, we have the comprehensive approach, where collected imagery is for the entire site. And this eliminates the need to extrapolate using lower quality imagery. Obviously a much more intensive effort, but it increases the confidence in the data, and that high resolution map is beautiful to look at. Unmanned aerial systems are called systems because they're made of several components. The vehicle, the sensor, and not pictured is the pilot. The type of data collection is going to inform vehicles and give a presentation all about LiDAR subsequently, so stay tuned for that. To prepare.
So, you guys don't have, did it come back on?
Yeah, Ben, it came back on right before you.
Sorry, I had sound corrected this, but for some reason it didn't save, so it's kind of all over the place, but bizarrely it seems to have only played when I'm unmuted. So, all right, we'll see what we can do here. I'll rewind a couple of minutes or a minute.
We can get down to incredible accuracy, much better than what's available from traditional LiDAR data sets. My coworker, Bruce Orr, is going to give a presentation all about LiDAR subsequently, so stay tuned for that. To prepare for the flight, in the office, you'll develop a flight plan and safety protocols, coordinate site access, any necessary agency permissions, and FAA approval. Lots to coordinate there. I'm not going into a lot of details there. And then in the field, the pilot sets up base stations for later processing. The static observation of known or set locations allows for later processing and refinement of the locations collected by the UAS. Some sensors in the UAS have internal GPS units, and so fewer ground control points are needed. And we can collect survey-grade data with those. Then fly the programmed flight plan. The flight's autonomous, but still the pilot needs to be observing and, on occasion, making changes or interventions to the plan. Next, in the office, we will post-process the data using any of a number of softwares available. I'm not going to go into much of the technical detail here, but suffice to say that post-processing of the base stations improves the accuracy of the GPS down to just several centimeters. and then the results are used to correct the UAS collected locations. The corrected geotag image files are then imported into photogrammetry software. Locations are verified for accuracy, and then potential products can be assembled, including an orthomosaic map, dense point cloud, mesh for texture, digital surface model, digital terrain model. And next, I'm going to step back to comparison of needs and a few hypothetical projects. So the top left is imagery that perhaps all of us are a little too familiar with. I'm sure you've seen it. Something that lacks sufficient detail for how you want to analyze it. The other three are results from flying at approximately 400 feet, 150 feet, and 50 feet. And you can actually start to tell Shonoplectus, bulrush, from Typha, cattail, at the highest resolution. That's at 0.5 centimeter per pixel. That was actually 3 years ago, and now we can get as accurate as 0.25 centimeter per pixel. Flight time is a function of altitude. So lower elevation flights are going to allow you to capture higher resolution imagery, but it'll require more passes. We're going to go into the case studies now. So first up, I'll talk about a couple projects we've worked on in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta for California Department of Water Resources, Winter and Chips Island. Both of these are habitat restoration projects. An important component of each was to conduct pre-project invasive plant species removal, primarily aquatic invasive plant species. For each of these, we use the subsampling methods. For one of them, we use the point just to fly to specific spots and collect imagery, which actually allowed us to identify a new invader in the delta, Alternantha, which is very similar looking in commonly available imagery to Ludwigia. And then at the other island, at Chips, we did the plot subsampling method. In both cases, we used more commonly available base imagery to extrapolate onto. And you can see one of the products here is a invasive vegetation map. The reason we chose UAS for each of these was because of the large size of the islands and the extent of the inaccessible aquatic habitat and the dense emergent vegetation that restricted ground access. Moving on to a project that we conducted monitoring for over the last 3 years. This is a flood control project with a wetland mitigation requirement that needed to be monitored and reported. So we needed to evaluate the success of mitigation plantings. So we conducted a comprehensive flight over the entire area. There weren't any monitoring plots to need to do a statistical analysis on to determine the confidence of the extrapolation. And we used that imagery that we collected to then map the vegetation. And it's incredible to get to have that fresh imagery out with you in the field, let me tell you. It allowed us to differentiate between species just basically looking at the imagery, not even in the field, but then in the field, able to really precisely locate yourself, like, oh, there's that tiger, I see it. This is the result just in comparing year 1 to year 2. You can see the incredible growth of the planted native vegetation that colonized the area disturbed by the flood control project. And the reason we chose UASs at this site was because the current imagery was not just insufficient resolution, but it was pre-construction imagery. So it would have been difficult to map vegetation that didn't even exist in the available imagery. Also, the site was small, and it was pretty quick and easy to collect the very high resolution imagery. A couple of the limitations here were like power lines and bridges, and also a big consideration was the tides. Time the imagery collection for low tide so that we could differentiate between open water, mudflats, and emergent vegetation. So that flood control project is on the left. Compare that at a very different scale to the Lower Napa River flood control project in the North Bay area. And the performance goals for the Napa project were established using much broader habitat types. And so we were able to use a coarser resolution on the imagery we collected for monitoring and reporting on progress toward the desired habitat acreages. Moving south to the Central California coast is a project we did for California State Parks. The goal here was to restore the estuary to its historic size and functions, enhance aquatic, riparian, and wetland habitat for a bunch of species: juvenile steelhead, snowy plover, California red-legged frog, wetland bird habitat, and habitat highly suitable for tidewater goby. We used the UAS to collect imagery and elevation data, and we collected some supplemental ground topography surveys and combined those into a design surface to inform restoration opportunities, including reconnecting the historical floodplain, creating tidal inlets to increase floodplain inundation, and enhancing habitat for tidewater goby and steelhead. This is the example product. This is the preferred conceptual design that we were able to prepare using the UAS collected imagery and digital elevation model incorporated into a CAD software. Moving from coastal into the Sierra Nevada mountains and into a different application of monitoring via UAS, we have a project where the goals were to monitor geomorphic feature responses to changes in flow regime and to map the grain size at sites throughout a large and diverse watershed. We used the UAS to collect imagery and elevation data again, and we created this facies map of average grain size on different geomorphic surfaces. Heading back to Central California coast is a project for creeklands. The goal here was to increase habitat complexity and refugia near the estuary. And so a large wood and boulder ballast habitat enhancement features were installed. And we continue using UAS for ongoing monitoring to monitor the placement and stability of the large wood and boulder structures. We have found that there's certain restraints for using UASs. You've definitely heard a lot of the benefits already in terms of access and efficiency. Constraints and considerations for using UAVs include we can't always use them to identify a species. You may not be able to get close, or you might need to have a hand lens. Also, some habitats are harder to obtain distinct species-specific signatures, like river or grasslands just show up so similar to one another. Vegetative cover is sometimes a performance goal that requires monitoring, but places with multiple vegetation layers will still require on-the-ground sampling for the understory. Low-density populations often have a weaker aerial photograph signature. So if you're looking for a specific rare plant or a specific invasive, it may not have a strong enough signature to really show up unless it's a dense population. As stated earlier, the infrastructure is definitely something to watch for: power lines, bridges, airports, tidally influenced areas. Also, wind and water are considerations so that your equipment doesn't get lost. And what's next for UAS technology? We're looking forward to returning to some sites we've continued doing monitoring for. We have an opportunity to do monthly monitoring of an invasive plant to evaluate the effectiveness of treatment over time. We also want to incorporate some techniques that we've used with other imagery data sets into our UAS imagery. Canopy height data from elevation models to inform habitat mapping and automated classification through the use of NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, things that involve multispectral imagery. And, you know, UAS technology is constantly improving. We could see more geomorphic monitoring as the vertical resolution gets fine-tuned. And we may also have self-driving UASs in the not-too-distant future who are able to navigate within a canopy and around different tree trunks. Lastly, I just want to repeat that there are exciting developments with LiDAR technology, and my colleague Bruce Orr has a subsequent presentation on that topic. And that about covers it. I want to give a shout out and thanks to our project partners. Hope you learned a few things, and at the conclusion here, Bruce Orr is going to take any questions. Thanks so much for having me. Feel free to contact me at the email address given right there.
All right. Well, sorry about that, folks. Thanks for persevering with us through that. But as Bruce pointed out, maybe the audio issues just had everybody paying even closer attention. So I will hand any questions over now to Bruce and tee up the next audio, which, just so y'all know, that was a very specific single audio issue for one video. So we won't have that issue for any of the others. Go for it, Bruce.
All right. Well, let's see. I guess first is, are there any questions? I'm not seeing any chat questions. So if anyone wants to either ask questions in the chat or speak up, we can do that. Or if not, we can move on to the LiDAR, this presentation. And Ben, you have that queued up, right?
Correct.
Hey, Bruce, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And Rob and absentee. Do you have any cost estimates? I mean, just kind of general, you know, what did some of the costs associated with those case studies that Rob mentioned?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I had a good summary. We some of the other folks it changes, you know, every year the costs are coming down. So, you know, one of the things is the you know, basic drone system with, you know, good resolution imagery for still photography or video is you know, for a couple $1,000 you can get something that's pretty good. And so there's cost of the basic equipment. There's if you're using it for commercial use, you have to be certified through the FAA process. So for us, that's, you know, we've got some certified operators that we have to use. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them yet, but we have some other like some of our academic collaborators or nonprofits do some just basic drone imagery collection under, you know, sort of recreational guidelines. You can follow it, so that's a cheap route to go. So really, the if you have the equipment yourself, you and for the higher grade like LiDAR collection, sometimes we'll actually rent, you know, a larger drone that can do something more capable, larger scale imagery. So, you know, that adds to the cost. And then what I don't have a good handle on is it's really a labor. Once you have the setup and the software, it's, you know, it's labor processing similar to GIS. So, you know, over the years, I don't know about you, but in the early years of GIS, my rule of thumb was take the initial estimate and multiply it by at least 5. And I think that's become much more standardized now. I'll try to see if I can get some actual numbers and follow up, work with Ben to post that information. But, you know, it's a pretty modest cost now for once you have the equipment for these local sites. And then, as I said, if you're scaling up to a larger scale operation, that's where the more sophisticated drones come into play, and it gets more expensive and just a lot more effort to piece together all the imagery.
Thanks, Bruce. That's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. For people with a small local project, maybe you don't want to do, maybe you don't need anything other than just the high resolution imagery to help visually extrapolate from your field observations. Mm-hmm. And so that would be that would be a very low cost effort. You could do that with a recreational drone, maybe spend $1,000 and have what you need to just cover that. So I think that's the low end, and then you're talking up to tens of thousands of dollars if you're renting higher grade equipment or spending a lot of processing time to cover a larger site.
Sure.
Yeah, and some of that cost too, and time is in the actual establishment of your points on the ground for georeferencing everything. So if you're looking at doing long-term repeated monitoring with a drone, then your costs actually come down quite a bit, kind of overall, because it's really that first initial setup that takes a lot of time to get everything locked in.
That's a really good point, because one of the benefits is you can have this pre-programmed flight plan that you can repeat time after time. So as Ben said, once you have that set up and established, it's much simpler.
All right. Well, if everybody's ready, we'll jump into Bruce's LiDAR chat, and then he will be available after that as well. And Bruce, do you have any setup beyond that relating at all to what you presented yesterday, or?
So I think I referenced my talk yesterday, so I tried not to repeat that since people can catch the recording online.
Okay.
So let's just go straight to the video and then take it from there.
Sounds good.
Good afternoon. I hope you've been enjoying the workshop so far today. I'd like to now talk briefly about use of LiDAR in assessing vegetation structure and modeling wildlife habitat suitability, and give you some ideas on how that may or may not play into your monitoring needs. By way of introduction, I'm Bruce Orr from Stillwater Sciences, and we've been working with LiDAR in various capacities for about 20 years now. So today I just want to try to keep this fairly brief. I'll review LiDAR basics, and then I'll quickly go through a discussion of how LiDAR can feed into different models for wildlife habitat suitability, and then give you some case study examples on using LiDAR for topography and relative elevation, which we've covered in a variety of talks over in recent years at RiversEdge West conference, and then go into some bit more detail on using LiDAR to try to assess three-dimensional canopy structure of vegetation as well as canopy height. And then after this presentation, we'll go into a live, more informal discussion period, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, also referred to as airborne laser scanning or airborne laser mapping. There's an active sensor in classic LiDAR. We're talking about a piloted plane, fixed wing aircraft, but it can also be collected using helicopters and more recently drones. There are also ground-based LiDAR applications, which I won't be talking about today. So the sensor in the plane emits a variety of pulses, laser pulses, thousands of them per second. It's all being simultaneously differentially corrected using GPS and other measurements to get very accurate positional data. And then the computer controls the whole system, the flight path, and actual application of the LiDAR. So that the detector is picking up 1 to 5 returns per laser pulse. And depending on the vegetation, if it's just bare earth, there should just be a single pulse coming off of the ground. But if there's vegetation and other structure there, the LiDAR pulse may get reflected at various points as it passes through the canopy, resulting in multiple returns. So typically there are, we're looking at in commercial LiDAR applications these days, generally 1 to 10 returns per square meter. And the data are delivered in a three-dimensional data cloud or point cloud. And we can use this to get a direct measurement of three-dimensional structure of the terrain, forest vegetation, and picking up any human infrastructure as well that might be present in your area. Here's an animation just showing a point cloud return in colors, the different vegetation. And then in classic LiDAR processing, we use algorithms, the vendors use algorithms to remove that vegetation that's sort of treated as noise to get at the bare earth surface topography, which is then useful for a variety of project applications. We've been doing this for 20 years now, and then in more recent years, we're trying to make use of that noise represented by the vegetation to delve into that and get more accurate assessment of vegetation structure. Case study examples I'll be talking about next are from the Santa Clara River in Southern California. This is a natural river system subject to large resetting floods, still highly valuable for conservation purposes. In prior conferences, I've talked about our use of an eco-hydrological template to develop plans for restoration. Today, I just want to focus on how LiDAR fits into that planning for restoration and then feeds into post-implementation monitoring. And there's two areas where LiDAR plays into this. The initial planning is generating a basic topography, and then from that deriving a relative elevation layer, which we can use as a proxy for depth of groundwater. And then in prior applications, we've been focusing just using canopy height for vegetation structure. But most of what I'll be talking about today will be trying to delve into more detailed three-dimensional structure. On Santa Clara River, we have 5 main species of riparian birds. A number of these are probably familiar to you if you're working in riparian systems in the Southwest. We've collaborated with Jim Hatton, Matt Johnson, and others on assessing southwestern willow flycatcher and yellow-billed cuckoo habitat. And one application of the LiDAR data that's proven useful in some cases is generating canopy height data to feed into the flycatcher model. And Jim has tried that on the Upper Gila River where we had a project and found that it did improve the model performance. The challenge with LiDAR is it's expensive and sort of a custom application as opposed to the freely available satellite data the rest of the model is based on. So now I'd like to dive into how we've been looking at LiDAR on the Santa Clara River to assess vegetation and habitat structure in general and specifically for particular focal bird species of concern. And just to delve in, here's a aerial image of the primary study area. This is a historical East Grove riparian forest on the river. It's been one of the best areas of habitat for the last 200 years on the river, according to our historical ecology studies. The LiDAR can generate bare earth topography, and then we can use that to generate a relative elevation model. So the color coding here shows basically height above river. So blue is at the water surface elevation in the main channel, the dark blue, and then lighter blue within half meter to a meter relative elevation, and then scaling on up to greens, yellows, and oranges, indicating general elevation above the river. And in this reach, which is a gaining reach, it's also a pretty good proxy for depth to groundwater. Next quick application is just same study area, looking at the first returns of the LiDAR and subtracting that from the ground surface. We can generate a raster-based layer of canopy height values. In this case, the darker blue areas are cottonwood tree with canopy emerging from the surrounding vegetation, and the blue indicates canopy height of 10 to 20 meters. Next, I want to focus on application for bird surveys and bird habitat. This map just shows a number of point count stations that were used to monitor bird populations over time. And here are the same sites just showing on top of the relative elevation map. I'll be focusing on Kistner Site 3 next. And here we just zoom in, Site 3 and 4. For comparisons, we'll look at both of those. 3 has a denser canopy, as you can see from the aerial image, more open and more disturbed site at Site 4. Here's the relative elevation, just to give you another handle on that. And the tree canopy height layer. But now I want to zoom in and look at the full point count data to get that three-dimensional structure aspect. And at Kistner Site 3, here's the center of the bird point count station. We then clipped out the LiDAR data using a circular plot, in this case with a 25-meter radius. So in here, the point returns are coded by their elevation. We can then use that to generate canopy dimensional structure. With the GIS system, we can create a vertical belt transect through that point cloud data and use that to generate cross-sectional views such as this. You can see it's picking up the taller emergent cottonwood willow canopy, denser mid-story and shrub layers, as well as some near ground surface vegetation, and then the ground surface returns in the darker blue. Here's the same site, but we can take a virtual belt transect in a different direction just to get a sense of how that structure varies within that 25-meter plot. Here's an example of that. We can also then summarize all the point cloud information into vertical bands. In this case, those returns coming from the ground surface, that first meter, then various 1 meter increments, vertical increments going up through the canopy, and then we just sort of lump all together all returns from greater than 8 meters canopy. And just for comparison, here's that Kistner Site 4 that had the roads and the more open canopy structure. You can see that just from the point cloud data, as well as the cross section. And this summarizes the point cloud returns by vertical strata. You can see that the vast majority of the returns are from the ground surface. We've got work in progress on taking this to the next step of comparing that vertical structure with other methods of assessing vegetation structure in the field. Some of that was part of my talk yesterday, so I won't go into that in more detail, but be happy to talk about this during the discussion if you have questions. And then just to wrap up the recorded portion, I wanted to summarize key take-home points from my talk yesterday. That's recorded, so you can definitely refer back to it later. In this case, we were using standard LiDAR from a commercial vendor. We provided some general technical specifications. We had some challenges with the LiDAR, but we found it was definitely good as expected for estimating canopy height. It's good for estimating total canopy cover above the ground surface, especially in the tree layer or the shrub and tree layer. So basically from 1 meter on up, we found good correlations. It's definitely good for generating bare earth topographic surface, and that can be then used as a baseline for future monitoring, perhaps coupled with drone imagery, which would be easier and cheaper to do on an annual basis. You could use drones and structure from motion capture to generate a canopy height elevation layer that you can then subtract the higher resolution bare earth DEM from the LiDAR to track things over time and have a little more accuracy than you could get with just the drone alone. And then we found in the more open areas, it did a pretty good job of capturing good three-dimensional vegetation structure. Where we had challenges were in areas with really high density of upper leaf canopy in the tree layer that appeared to be blocking penetration of the LiDAR. So we had cases where we were missing mid-story canopy in the LiDAR where the field effort showed it was definitely present. Also cases where like dense willow thickets obscured some of the microtopography, in this case a side channel beneath the thicket. We're looking at ways to customize our technical specifications to get higher density LiDAR returns to address that issue. But that then becomes a cost issue if you're having custom requirements as opposed to sort of standard LiDAR that the vendors are used to collecting. And we're also combining LiDAR with multi and hyperspectral imagery to see if we can do a better job of differentiating individual species and native versus non-native vegetation. And with that, I think I will end the recording and we can move on to the discussion session.
Sorry,
All right.
Bruce, I was muted. Anybody got any questions for Bruce? Like I said, just shout them out.
Well, if not, one thing I didn't really highlight is the cost issue again. So I think the technology is changing every year, similar to the drones, but you're starting at a higher price point for LiDAR acquisition. But there now are LiDAR capable drones, but yet those are generally much more expensive, and unless you need a larger drone to carry the LiDAR sensor, and the sensor itself is expensive. So right now we're not making use of that technology, but that's sort of the next phase we want to be testing. For local projects, it's probably not likely to be within your budget to deal with LiDAR in any capacity unless you can take advantage of available LiDAR that someone else has collected. So a lot of our rivers and watersheds, flood control districts, and counties, and land managers are now acquiring LiDAR more frequently for their management purposes, both for the accurate topography, but more recently for estimates of vegetation type and biomass, maybe related to fuel loading and fire management. So one opportunity is to look for someone else that's has LiDAR needs and see if you can tag along either for free or maybe get if they're doing a flight nearby. Mobilization cost is a big part of the project, initial project cost, and especially if you're located far away from a regular airport. So if you can piggyback onto another planned flight, it's a smaller incremental cost to cover your site. So there are issues like that. And we've used it more on these larger scale restoration projects, and especially river corridor scale planning, where you're talking, miles or kilometers of river, sometimes up to 50 or 100 or even 150 miles of river, where the GIS and remote sensing application is very valuable for the assessment and planning. But then you can also use some of those same data sets when you start getting into restoration site planning, and a lot of our larger systems, because the LiDAR is expensive, we're using LiDAR initially and then sort of annual drone surveys, but with a plan to go back at either a 5 or 10 year interval or post major flood event, to try to set aside some budget to fly the LiDAR again after you've had a major resetting event, so you can track changes in both the channel geomorphology, floodplain topography, as well as what that means to vegetation alterations.
All right, cool. Thanks, Bruce. I think we're going to move on now to bird monitoring. So Matt, you want to steal the screen?
Yep. Let's go. All right, everyone see that?
We got your list, your file list up at the moment.
Oh, really? Huh. Oh. Uh-oh. Let's see. Oh, maybe I want this. Can you see that?
Yep, you're there.
All right, I'm going to go back. I got to go back somehow.
Okay. So hi everyone. We're going to talk about bird monitoring, and this was developed by myself and Jennifer Holmes. This is something we've been working on for the last 20 years on various projects that involved long-term monitoring with multiple species to long-term monitoring of single species with willow flycatcher and yellow-billed cuckoo. And I'm just going to talk mainly about, these are just ideas. These aren't, we're not suggesting how to go about a monitoring program, but these are just ideas that need to be considered. So you want to talk about your goals. And, I know Mark talked a lot about this, and this is one thing that we all get this funding right away. And then all of a sudden we just move right into this monitoring without really thinking about the goals. And it all depends on, do you want to track the trends of Southwest riparian birds as far as a community, which requires, the whole community of birds? Or do you want to look at the measures that affects the restoration as far as what just riparian birds, or even just a subset of riparian birds in a particular restoration site? Or do you want to highlight a value of healthy riparian habitat to riparian bird diversity, conservation, and public participation? And this is what we just started thinking about in a way that it could be possibly long-term, and you could look at multiple species and have public input, participation, and the cost may be lower, but you could get a lot of value out of this. So I'll talk about that later. So one example is, what we talked about, and I'll go through some examples here, is track trends in riparian birds of the Southwest. And this is long-term, and Mark emphasized on this, that these projects have to be long-term to be able to get any type of information. These 1 or 2 years, which a lot of monitoring programs end up being, don't really answer the questions. You aren't going to be able to find the trends. So develop this long-term monitoring to determine the status and trends in composition, abundance, and of that breeding riparian bird community. And this really requires, for an example, is to establish point count stations throughout many Southwest riparian habitats, and then determine the sampling methods and the schedule. And this is really long-term and of a huge scale. Or you could just, what I'll talk about more at the Park Service level, where we looked at different parks at this kind of level. Also, another example is measure changes of riparian birds at the restoration sites. You got to determine the study area and the length of time of that study. And what's really important with these restoration programs is you get a baseline before you start restoring. And that's not always the case, which is unfortunate, but if you have that baseline before you start restoration, it's really important. A perfect example is what we did on the Gila in the Safford area. And we right now have 6 years of data while they were doing restoration, before restoration, and then we've got all this data before the beetle is going to move in. And so that's ideal. And then develop it as spatial and temporal sampling frames, and repeat sampling within the year and across years. And then you could look at another monitoring, and which is pretty common right now, and which is mandated by law for a lot of these, is tracking threatened and endangered species or at-risk species. And this requires to determine the spatial scale across a region or a watershed or restoration site. And this depends on the distribution of the species, and then establishing that sampling sites and conduct those species-specific surveys following established protocols. And this fourth one is this buy-in by the public to increase public awareness of the value of healthy riparian habitat to bird diversity, and collect that useful data on abundance, distribution of those riparian birds. And again, this is determined, the design is to determine that spatial scale, the areas you really want to survey, and organize and promote, such as a riparian bird blitz during the breeding season. And that really brings a buy-in from the public. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. You got to have people that know their birds. You got to rely on them to be able to come out and do that. And you want to get, you know, one visit is great, but you'd like to get one to three visits to be able to cover that whole breeding period. And so there's a buy-in in the public, and you can, and this data could go to eBird, which has a huge database, and then you can actually look at trends of what those species are doing over a period of time. And it can be done in at beetle sites, you know, where beetles have affected the habitat, or in restoration sites. So one of the, I'll just discuss one of the ones that we've been involved in with the Park Service in the Southern Colorado Plateau, is to look at this long bird community monitoring. And it determines the status and trends and composition, abundance of breeding birds communities associated with selected habitats. And in this, with the Park Service, there were various habitats. There was mixed con, ponderosa pine, grassland, and riparian. And it really helped us, it helped the managers to improve their understanding of the bird habitat relationship. And so this example will go into a little bit more detail. This project with the long-term monitoring with the Park Service designed for a long-term monitoring program, 50 years. And we started it in 2007. This is last year, was the last year they did it. Funding got cut, so which was unfortunate. They are ongoing with vegetation, macroinvertebrates, and so they're still doing some parts of it, but the bird part got cut. But it was funded on a yearly basis, and we got 12 years worth of data, which was great, which is, I mean, huge for a lot of monitoring programs. And our sampling design provided data for estimating bird density and abundance using the program distance. Plots were spatially distributed across the habitat. There was multiple years of data and combined to increase that sample size. And with distance, you really require that 100 detections of each species to model the detection functions. So, you know, it had some requirements that we had to have to be able to monitor these trends of these certain species. And the thing is, the probability of detecting all birds present is less than 100%, leading to incomplete or unequal surveys. So, but two common methods to account for this are point counts using the distance sampling, and occupancy, which is looking at occupancy of those sites and looking at the proportion of area occupied by those species, which we are looking at we're looking at that, looking at trends over many years across these habitats with USGS right now with this data. There's designs considerations and numerous factors may influence the detectability of the birds in the field. And observer acuity is huge. I mean, you got to have observers that can see the bird, of course, but hear the bird. 80% of our detections are by ear. And so there's all these really small chip notes, all the songs. And when you're looking at multiple species, it requires a lot of skill. And so we start training 2 weeks before the season starts. And we really grill these guys to be able to account for all the birds that they're detecting. Also, the environmental factors affecting bird behavior, such as the weather is a big problem. You know, we have these huge windstorms. During high winds, it's hard to detect birds, rain or snow. And then dense vegetation, which is always a factor with riparian areas, and using point counts, because you want an exact distance from the observer to that bird to be able to get these detection functions accurate. So that's always a problem with distance. Now we've been able to do it, but it is a consideration when you're setting up your monitoring program. And then those temporal factors, the timing. And, you know, breeding is the ideal time. That's when you're going to get most of your birds when they're singing. During migration, you know, and they're using stopover habitat, they're only there for a short period of time and they move on, and they usually don't vocalize. So you're really not going to get any of that kind of information for looking at trends. And those behavioral attributes of the birds, are they secretive, and you're not really detecting them because they're not calling and singing while you're out there. And that is common with such as like the yellow-billed cuckoo. What we, for those 12 years, we had 3 to 4 field crew members. They conducted 600 to 800 point counts at 8-minute counts during May and July. And we conducted sampling we conducted habitat sampling also. So in the morning they would do point counts, and in the afternoon they would do veg. Now what the ideal situation is, the bird people do the bird part, and then you hire a veg crew to do the veg part. But we had the bird crew do both just because of saving funding. And it worked out fine, but you're doing 300 to 370 macro plots and 1,200 to 1,500 subplots. So there's a lot of data that veg data that collected also, because it's really habitat oriented. We collected the habitat data ranged from the veg cover of veg type, the canopy cover, the tree basal area, snag basal area, sapling density, and foliar cover. And it was all ranged from all these different habitat types, from pinyon juniper to grassland to riparian. In the riparian area, and that we didn't use this for the Park Service, but we had a Rio Grande project with the Army Corps. And we used a presence-absence scale to record stand composition, such as variation in plant species, individual live and dead status, and dead branch live dead status, and intercept with established vegetation strata at 5-meter sampling increments along the 50-meter transect. And this 50-meter transect really worked great based on the typical floodplain and the landform dimensions. And so this with as far as riparian, and we consulted with Pat Shavroff on this, and this is what he suggested and correlated with the bird abundance. And unfortunately, this got funded for 1 year, and then the funding got cut. So one of those one of those monitoring programs that you think, we're going to get really at least 5 years worth of data, and it was gone. So, but this is really important as far as the veg you collect to correlate with those birds. So in summary, the monitoring protocol for this program was to provide information over long term on the status and trends of most bird species in monitored habitats. And over years, you can improve those understandings of bird habitat relations and possible effects of habitat changes, and really look at those trends, long-term trends. And factors such as a fire came in and really affected a huge area of Bandelier. We already had all this before data. The fire came through. We were able to look at how it affected the species composition of the birds and the density. And then as things were recovering from that fire, how that changed the bird composition again. And these are all protocols that were established. And this is was established in 2015, and Jen and I wrote this, and is available with the Park Service on this website. And it's very detailed. I mean, I just glossed over how it's set up, but it's a very detailed protocol, and I recommend this as far as an example. And then as far as monitoring restoration sites, you want to modify these long-term designs to acquire adequate sample size analysis using the sampling, distance sampling at occupancy. The size of the area will affect the spatial and temporal sampling. So, like an example of what we do been doing on the Gila, and the sizes of where they were doing restoration varied dramatically. And then, so for example, in a relatively small site, you want to do multiple counts per week or breeding season to get that sample size to actually see those changes. And then there's endangered species monitoring. And, there's a lot of programs that are going on. One on the lower Colorado that Marianne has been involved in. Dave Moore with the Rio Grande with the willow flycatcher and the yellow-billed cuckoo. We've Barb Coos with the Lisa Bell's Vario in California. And what we're doing on the Gila with the yellow-billed cuckoo and the willow flycatcher. There's also these not endangered species, but at-risk species such as the common blackhawk And we did quite a bit of monitoring in Fossil Creek and looked at trends and how those changes that occurred. And, with the Southwest willow flycatcher, its habitat requirements are different. They require that early successional heterogeneous structure, dense vegetation, and that associated with that water, that saturated soil, compared to the yellow-billed cuckoo, which prefers, they're both riparian obligates, but prefers that cottonwood gooding, willow, cottonwood's significant component for foraging, and then breeding in close proximity to water, but doesn't need that standing water, and does not need that tamarask, which willow flycatchers, have kind of become dependent on. And that canopy is different. There are different layers of these two species that require this different monitoring. But they both require the survey protocol, which is a call playback technique and recommended for the detection of the species that are secretive. Willow flycatchers aren't that secretive, but the yellow-billed cuckoo is, or they're low in densities and they're in dense vegetation. And it's really designed to look at presence absence and maximize detectability and efficiency, but it's not designed to establish the distribution, abundance, or breeding status. That really requires more visits and more questions. And I know that Marianne and Dave have looked way more at productivity, and which I have also looked on the Gila and those habitat associations and the effects of the beetle. So there's all kinds of things that this establishes a baseline as far as where these birds are, but then you can dive into other questions that require a lot more effort. And, one of the things about these is it's really recommended that the yearly surveys occur, because there's so much yearly variation. And we see that a lot of these programs have declined in funding, which has really affected how much surveys are going on. And you're not seeing, we have no idea what their status is any longer. But occupancy modeling is one of those tools, and we're using this with USGS again to look at the willow flycatcher and Jim Hatton and look at occupancy of these sites. Productivity, you can look at productivity over the years, but it does require that you do that on a yearly basis to see those variation in productivity. For the cuckoo, you want to maybe even look at prey base and how it may affect the cuckoo distribution abundance, because they like those bigger bugs that can go in that are population cycles are up and down. And then a lot of these birds are neotropical migrants. They winter in South and Central America for I don't know how long, for 9 months out of the year, a lot of the time. Then they come and breed in North America for 3 or 4 months. And so there's a whole suite of things that we don't know what's going on in their winter grounds that could be affecting their population, and how you monitor that is another huge question. And then there's this riparian bird blitz. And this is just an idea that Jen and I have been thinking about that could be done to get the public involvement, and it could really, if you had the buy-in and you had the organization to organize it, it could really be something of value. And it highlights the value of that your community wants that healthy riparian habitat to riparian bird diversity and conservation. You have this yearly blitz during the breeding season. You definitely try to get one visit, if possible, two. And there's that substantial public involvement. And you get this data on presence, absence, maybe abundance on riparian bird species. And you add that data to the eBird website, and it's something that I think has some real value. In the end, though, it all depends on your goals. That's the bottom line. What Mark really emphasized was these got to be long-term. These 1 or 2 years just don't tell you a thing. And funding is the biggest problem anymore. A lot of these programs have really been cut. Even endangered species programs to look at long-term monitoring has been cut. So, how do we get around that? And that's why, I'd love to be able to set up the same program we did with the Park Service, because you get really quality data, because you're hiring the right people and you get this consistency. But if not, how do we get around that? what are ways to get the public buy-in and get some reliable data. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Anybody have any questions for Matt?
Matt, do you prefer eBird over iNaturalist? Have you ever used iNaturalist?
I haven't. I haven't looked. I've seen it, you know, but I have never used that. Or the eBird data that we used was really valuable in a climate change project that we were involved in with USGS, and it worked out great. The data was very reliable and at a very large scale. But there are, you know, eNaturalist is another one, but I'd be, you know, those are those options that you could definitely look at.
Hey, Matt, thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. Quick question. Some of our colleagues have just started looking at passive acoustic detectors to supplement protocol cuckoo surveys. And, you know, we've been using them for bat sort of community surveys for a while now. So I'm wondering what you might be able to say about the status of acoustic detection for avian community surveys and pros and cons. I assume it would have to, like with bats, you'd want to calibrate it with field surveys and confirmation of what species are actually there.
Yeah, I'm just starting on a project using acoustic, and there's a graduate student that we have that's been looking at with the yellowbill cuckoos, which is, but there's value in it. There's a few problems as far as you can determine presence absence, but you can't determine abundance. That's the one. I mean, you could have multiple speakers, which Nick set up for his yellowbill cuckoo, and he was able to determine where those birds were, and you could kind of say, well, there's more than one, you know, so there's these two calling back and forth. But it was really difficult. It's really difficult to get any type of abundance. You also have to set it up, and you have to go retrieve it. You have to change the cards and the batteries. But the software has come a long ways where you can program it for the different species, and you can really. And if someone's knowledgeable, like what we've got with Nick, he can go through that pretty well and determine all these species that are in there. But it definitely requires that programming part of it. Yeah, and the bird has to vocalize, you know, so like a cuckoo can be there the whole time and not even vocalize. And that's another. Now with spotted owls, they've been using the recorders like in Zion, but they know where those owls are. They've been setting up territories for years. They set up the recorders, and they get a lot of great information as far as occupancy, you know, that those birds are, and it cuts the amount of time that they in the past had to go in and survey, and you're at night and all those factors that involve night survey. So with spotted owls, and if you know where those owls are really occupying the sites, you can look at that occupancy rate with those recorders. So there's some value, but I think it still is a long ways away from taking that human factor away.
Thanks, Matt. Looks like Elaine asked, do you use IMBCR protocols? They're considering including some point counts in the monitoring efforts.
I'm not familiar. What is that again? You got to. I've heard of it. What is that again?
Elaine, you want to speak up?
Yeah, we have a birder on our staff, and she has done some surveys with. Now I don't remember what it was with. It's the Rocky Mountain Conservancy uses the protocol, and you were familiar with it.
Yeah, it's real similar to, it's using point counts, and Rocky Bird Observatory or Conservancy does a lot of the same work that we've done, but they're mainly in Forest Service areas, but they do point counts. I think they're doing 9-minute point counts. They really emphasize in a lot of these habitat relationships. They don't do a lot of the habitat work we did with the Park Service, and a lot of those programs that all requires funding. They only do one visit, which we really question, just because that one visit, where do you really select that period of time during that breeding period? And you could miss a lot of species, because like yellowbill cuckoos come in June, middle of June, willow flycatchers start breeding in mid-May, and they can be done by mid-June. So I mean, there's some factors that that I know a lot of these protocols look at, and it's a lot of driven by funding. But there's a lot of variation among a lot of these different protocols that you really have to consider, and those visitations is huge as far as getting at least 2 visits, preferably 3.
All right, thanks, man. I'm sorry we're going to have to move on, but IMBC has been, Tracy threw it up for us in the chat box, so if you want to see what it is, but we're going to move on real quick. Thanks so much, Matt. And like I said, we can hang around as long as we want at the end of the day, but want to try to get finished by 4:30 here. So we're going to move on to a quick video on Tamarisk beetle monitoring protocols.
Hi, my name is Ben Bloodworth. I work with RiversEdge West as the program coordinator for the Tamarisk Beetle Monitoring and Education Program. I want to talk to you today about taking beetle monitoring points and how you can provide that data to us. First, we're going to go over a sweep net procedure. It was developed in coordination with the Colorado Department of Agriculture and UC Santa Barbara more than a decade ago, and is how we've gotten most of our data for points across the West. So the equipment you'll need is a data sheet that we provide on our website for recording your observations, a GPS unit so that we know where those observations are being recorded, and a sweep net is very handy to actually capture insects that may be on the tree. If you don't have access to a sweep net, we'll also talk about protocols we have for observing the tree rather than sweeping. So where do you want to sweep? Basically, any tamarisk anywhere is good to look for beetles because we like to know where they are and where they aren't. A good clue for where they may be is the yellowing of the tree, like on this one you see behind me. So this is a prime candidate for sweeping. It's not a completely green tamarisk. There's something going on here. It may or may not be beetle or another insect. It could just be a natural process of the tree, but that's why we're going to sweep and see what is on this tree, if anything. So for the visual observation, basically you find a plant and look at it for 5 minutes to see if there are any signs of beetle, eggs, larvae, or adults. This can really be necessary in an area that's been hit really hard by the beetle in the past, and there are just a few green branches in the center of the tree that doesn't allow you to sweep the tree. So we'll try that right now on this tree behind me. So we're just going to look until we find beetle or 5 minutes is ended. So basically you just start visual observation looking for any eggs or adults. We have an adult right here. Also, one that can count for the observation is a larva, which we have right here. So obviously, within just a few seconds, we found beetles on this tree. So this you would mark as a presence point. You could, if you wanted to, actually look at the entire tree and see if the amounts of insects are high, and note that on your sheet as well. So the sweeping protocol is maybe a little confusing because it's 5 sets of 5 sweeps. So what does that mean? Basically, that means if you find a large tree like this one, you can do all 5 of your sets of sweeps on this tree. If you just have a few scattered trees, you can kind of get a GPS point among those trees and just do 5 sets of sweeps. So what is a set of sweeps? Basically, one set is 5 sweeps with this net. Then you will do that an additional 4 times on that tree for 5 sets of 5. So you're actually doing 25 sweeps with the net that counts as 1 point. You always want to sweep up if possible because the beetles have a built-in mechanism that they drop from a limb when that limb is disturbed. So if you go down, you will probably just knock them onto the ground. So basically, we want to do a set of sweeps like this. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you want to make sure that whatever you caught stays in there, so you can sweep the net back and forth like this. Grab it, and then we're going to observe to see what we have in here, if anything. So basically, just begin to get down into the net. Oh, we have an adult beetle there already. And this is a first instar larva on the sheet that's called a larva with no stripe. Continue to look down into the bottom of the net. See if we have anything else. Oops, some little bug just flew off. Then we have another adult. We have quite a few more adults in here. If you get down to the bottom, you can see that more adults. All the way to the bottom. So we had, see, looks like about 14 adults, 1 larva with no stripe, and there's a third instar larva that actually has the yellow stripe down the side. So on our data sheet, we record 1 larva with no stripe, 1 with a stripe, and then 14 adults for the first sweep. Then we'll do another 4 sweeps for 1 observation point on the tree. So here we've got samples of another sweep. You can see some adult beetles crawling around. Oh, and here we have quite a few larvae. These are all, well, there's one second instar, that one at the top there crawling. It's a smaller guy. And then the third instar, those bigger ones down there, actually in that tamarisk litter. Those would be recorded on the sheet. Both of those are recorded on the sheet as older larva, a larva with a line. You can see the little yellow line down their side. Once you've recorded your data on the sheet, obviously it doesn't really help me out or other people who want to know about it out unless you send it to someone. So I would very much appreciate you sending me your data, and it will go on our annual map, which you can find on our website at any time. Basically, I will take it in any format you want to send it. If you just want to take a picture of your data sheet, if you want to enter it into an Excel spreadsheet, if you want to just go and find that GPS point on Google Earth and send me a Google Earth image or a Google Earth KMZ file. I take GIS shape files and I can send you an empty shape file for you to populate if you want. But basically, any way you can get me your data, I would love to have it. Thanks much and happy sweeping. All right, so there's the beetle protocols. I believe many of you have probably sent me data, and we worked with Matt this year to develop a more advanced protocol that actually gets at tamarisk phenology and such as well. And I happily send out empty shape files with all of those fields to populate. So, any questions before we move on to some data collection? All right, well, we will hop right in then. Emily from the Dolores River Restoration Partnership was gracious enough to hop on and provide us with kind of quick how-to on using field collection tablets and kind of how easy it is. So we'll hop right in to that now.
Hi.
Oops.
Hi everyone, thanks for making it to this monitoring workshop and the end of the conference here. Today I'm going to talk about how to use basic functions in Arcgis Products.
Hi
Hi everyone, thanks for making it to this monitoring workshop and the end of the conference here. Today I'm going to talk about how to use basic functions in Arcgis Products to help you and your field crews collect monitoring data. My name's Emily Cassian, my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Watershed Program Manager at the Southwest Conservation Corps, which is a program of conservation legacy. And part of my role is co-coordinating the Dolores River Restoration Partnership. And as part of that, I run the partnership's vegetation monitoring program. I help train field crews that perform the protocol. So I'm going to mainly reference my experience on the Dolores during this video and sort of what I've learned through the monitoring effort there over the past few years. So the purpose of this video is to focus on how you can use Arcgis products to help you collect monitoring or other spatial data for that matter, treatment data, that sort of thing. The intention of this is not really to be a how-to video. This is more to show you how easy it can be to collect useful spatial data. It's meant to provide an overview of options, so show you what's worked for me. So you don't need to be a GIS expert. Let's keep things simple and basic. I'm going to talk about these Arcgis products. There are so many Arc products that are useful, but I'm just going to talk about desktop or Arc Map, Arc Online, and then the two field data collection apps, Collector and Field Maps. So just so you're aware, Esri's nonprofit program makes these products a lot more accessible for nonprofits. I have the link there in the presentation. So what do we need for data collection? So let's say you've designed your monitoring plan, you're ready to get out in the field and collect some data. So really we need to create a data form, right? Like the digital version of our paper forms to collect data. So this is our feature class. So yeah, think of this as our paper log with a spatial aspect. It's tied to a point, polygon, or line that has a specific location on the Earth's surface. You know, we want to be able to add these feature classes to maps that have some sort of base map like topography or satellite imagery. And we want to be able to download these maps to tablets for offline data collection and share these with crews, technicians, partners, you know, whoever's doing the data collection. All right, so we're going to start with creating a feature class. So this can be done in Arc Desktop or Arc Online. So a feature class, the technical definition, I suppose, is a collection of geographic features that share a geometry type, right? So points, lines, polygons. In this example of the table here, I have my photo point feature class, so points. So when you first create your feature class, you want to create different fields, the different pieces of information you want for each feature. So in this picture, my fields are date, names of data collectors, photo point name, etc. So you can create drop-down menus for your fields, and these are called domains. You can enable attachments for each feature. So, for example, this is great for photo points. And as you collect your data, so in this table, for instance, as I drop photo points, you end up creating a attribute table. Okay, so collection in the field, Esri's apps that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about collector and field maps. So there's many others. I'm just going to focus on these because collector is what I'm familiar with. And then field maps is pretty new. It's sort of a replacement for collector and supposed to be a combination of some of Esri's other apps with increased functionality. So the basics of field maps, as far as I know, is similar to collector, but I haven't gone through a full field season with it yet. Yeah, so both of these are free to download, but again, they're pretty useless without Arc Online and that Esri license. So here's sort of an overview of our process, right? So we're going to create a feature class in Arc Map or Arc Online. In Arc Online, then, you add your feature class to a map, and your map can have multiple feature classes depending on the, the different types of data you want to collect. For instance, I want to drop photo points, I want to draw polygons for invasive species inventory, etc. I want to download this map then to Collector or Field Maps app, which allow you then to go into the field. Since the map is downloaded, you don't need internet access out in the field. You can go offline and collect your monitoring data. And then when you're done, you can come back to internet access and sync your data back to the feature class that is housed in Arc Online. And then your sync data is going to show up in your downloaded maps. So if you go back into the field, you're going to have access to the data that you've synced. So here's an example of what Arc Collector can look like. So here I've opened the app in my phone. And I'm going to show you what it looks like to create some features. So I'm going to click on that DRRP monitoring map, which I have already downloaded. Just for your reference, this looks similar on a tablet as to a phone, so there really isn't a big difference between the two. So here I'm going to collect a polygon. Right now I've selected, the features I have in this map, and I clicked on my monitoring, which is a polygon feature. So one of the things you can do in Collector is just digitize and draw your own polygon. You can also sync your steps if you want to, have the app drop points as you walk around a certain landscape or whatever. So anyways, I've drawn a polygon now, and now I'm just filling out the associated data with it. This is, that feature in that form that goes with, each one of these polygons that I'm going to collect. So yeah, right now I'm just filling out that data, and then here in the next couple seconds, it'll show you what drop-down menus look like. So, these are the options I've given myself for these different fields. So once I'm done with that, I click that check mark and it saves. And then if I want to collect another feature, I go in there and, select photo points or whatever, and I am able to do that. All right, so here is an example of what all your data might look like once you get back into your Arc Online. Here is that same monitoring map, and here is our data. So this polygon is our monitoring polygon, that we may have collected, and here's the associated, feature and data that's been collected with it. And there's lots of different features here, right? So we have invasive species polygons here. So like this one is Russian knapweed, and this one is a polygon of white top, just, showing where those actual infestations are. I've got photo points here. So let me show you attachments real quick. If I click on this photo point and I can scroll down, I have enabled attachments for my photo point feature. So, I can click on the actual attachment and see the photo. So this is just an example of what your data might look like in Arc Online. All right, so I'd like to talk about hardware for a bit. I like to use tablets in the field, but you can use, field maps or Collector on a cell phone. Tablets are just bigger and easier to use. So Apple or Android tablets work just fine. I prefer Android, but that's just a personal preference. Really, the basic requirements that your tablet needs to have are GPS, ample memory, and it needs to be durable. So my recommendation is the Samsung Galaxy Tab Active 2 or Tab Active 3. The Tab Active 3 is just the newer model, so it's a little bit pricier than the Active 2. The reason I like this tablet is because it is really made for field work. It's made, to be durable and be out in the elements. So what else do we need to make sure we're field ready? If you're working in tight canyons and your GPS signal, may not be super strong, you can use a Garmin Glow, which sort of amplifies that signal. You want a memory card if you're collecting a lot of data, especially a lot of photos. You want to put your tablet in a durable case. So even the Tab Active 2, I put in a case to double up that durability. And then I provide crews with dry bags or waterproof tablet cases, like what's pictured here. We're working along rivers. Also, it rains, so we want to make sure that we can protect our tablets. And then I send my crews with external batteries too to make sure that they have plenty of juice while they're out in the field. Hopefully I've helped show you how easy it can be to get ready for field data collection. So for things like creation of geodatabases, feature classes, maps, downloading these things onto Collector and whatnot, Esri has tutorials, and YouTube is also a great resource for how-to videos. And that's how I learned to do a lot of this myself. So hopefully now you are feeling a bit more ready to go collect that data. So I want to thank you for your time. Please email me if you have any questions or want to chat and follow up. I'd be happy to do that with y'all. And thanks again.
All right. Thanks so much, Emily. Anybody have any questions about the quick data collection for Emily while I tee up Mark? All right, I think it's getting long in the day. People are getting a little brain fried. But we're going to close it out with a discussion by Mark on some funding data. So, Mark, feel free to take it back over.
Okay, Ben, I'm still here.
Sweet, me too.
You got my screen, I hope. Can we see this?
Yep, you're good.
Look at that. All right, so hi everybody again. We wanted to end the workshop with a discussion, a quick presentation, and I emphasize that. I know we're late in the day and ninth inning, so to speak, and everybody's a little blurry eyed. So this is just a 5-minute kind of fodder for maybe a discussion afterwards on funding for monitoring. It's in the context of stream restoration. You know, how to monitor or fund support stream restoration projects, but you can apply to monitoring just about anywhere. You know, including the discussions by Matt and Bruce and Emily and everybody else. So so what we did for this quick presentation is kind of pass the wisdom hat around to people and just sort of ask them of any ideas, strategies that they've heard of or been involved with that would help assist, promote funding of monitoring in the long term. And just want to acknowledge a few folks here that contributed. We had quite a list. I just picked out 7 here just to highlight it and maybe get the discussion going. But we heard from the Walton Family Foundation, Coca-Cola Foundation, and Bonneville Environmental Fund, and then watershed groups such as the Friends of Verde River, Gila River Partnership, Lower Gila River Collaborative, Grand Staircase, Escalante Partners, amongst others, and a few on this panel too. So it was a nice collection of ideas. So I'll just run through these really quick, hopefully get people thinking about funding and monitoring. And you know, I've been involved with river stuff for years. You know, Matt, Bruce, same way. Ben, all been around the block. And I guarantee you that all of us, and I know this for a fact because we all talked about it, that even when we started in doing our work in the late 80s, 90s, whatever, monitoring was always, I mean, it's the same issue. You know, monitoring is simply not funded near enough. We discussed during this workshop some of the values of monitoring and some of the repercussions of not doing so. So, you know, this discussion was in part trying to see if we can get our heads around some ideas of how potentially we can get monitoring funded a little bit more. So I'll run through these real quick. Again, fodder for the workshop discussion. One is, I already mentioned earlier, but when you or as you get funding for stream restoration or whatever projects you're working on, and monitoring needs to be a part of it, at least to quantify how well your project is achieving its goals and objectives and that kind of thing, don't even assume that it is not part of the implementation budget. You know, funders often, at least in my experience, say, you know, you got to use this for implementation. Great. Monitoring is part of that. You use 10, 10% or whatever for is just becomes automatic. Don't ask questions, just assume. And for number 2 here, if you do have funders or a funding source that really leans on you and says, you know, we don't do the monitoring thing, lean back on them. I mean, the monitoring is such a win-win. I mean, by win-win, I mean win for the recipients of the funding and win for the funder as well. It is a prerequisite activity for understanding what was accomplished. You just simply can't demonstrate success without monitoring, which really is something that funders, particularly funders that are in it for the long term, have to have in order to prove their worth as well. So lean back. Have in your back pocket, one of the ones that was mentioned by Watershed, one of the Watershed Group folks, was kind of having a rule of thumb, and this is a great idea, is that whatever your total project budget is, 10%, 15% automatically gets just put aside for monitoring. It's sort of your rule of thumb. We often use the 1/4, 1/2, 1/4 rule, where 1/4 of your total project budget is for planning, and evaluating site conditions. 1/2 is used for actually implementing the restoration tactics in the project itself, and 1/4 is then used for post-implementation stuff like monitoring and maintenance. But whatever, have a rule of thumb rule in your back pocket that you pull out, and it becomes just part of the budget negotiation automatically up front. Develop a Cadillac Pinto approach to your monitoring. So, we're talking long-term, and of course, as you talk about temporally long-term, incorporate kind of a spatial temporal methodological flexibility in your monitoring program that allows you to continue monitoring during lean times when inevitably you're not going to have funding. So if you're talking about, Matt mentioned several times, and all of us couldn't agree more, is that monitoring is inherently has to be a long-term process, decadal in nature. And there's going to be times during that process, that time period, where you're simply not going to have a lot of funds. That's just inevitable. And being able to adapt and your monitoring program so that maybe you don't do quite as much during lean times. Maybe you only do photo points when you have lean years versus doing the whole thing. Maybe you don't do as many sites, but it becomes sort of an inherent part of your entire monitoring program that then you can continue to at least collect data in the long term, and during those lead times, and then hope for the non-lean times, and when you get back to the more Cadillac version of your monitoring program. One thing that we found that it's not so much an idea that is on the end of getting more funding per se, but maybe in the vein of making your monitoring funding go a bit longer, is establishing an interjurisdictional trained monitoring team. And what I mean by this, I'll go back to the example I've been using previous presentation, but when you have a monitoring, if you have a stream restoration project that involves multiple management entities, and in this case, this is the Rio Grande Bravo again, along the Big Bend reach of that river, and you have entities in Mexico, you have NPS in the US and Texas state parks, and then further down the river, you have a bunch of private entities, including CEMEX and the like. You have this type of situation of multiple entities in an area where you're doing restoration work, and it's easy, not easy, but one of the sort of default is where you have a sort of monitoring that's done just specifically a focus with one of these specific entities, and so you have a team or groups of people that are only doing monitoring on this side of the river here, maybe only with the Park Service side down over here with CEMEX, and here in private lands. And what we found, takes a lot of coordination, but we have a binational team that is trained along the river in the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo as part of our overall binational team, and allows them to not only monitor on the Mexican side of the river and the US side and go back and forth, but also monitor on the Mexican side in CONAP lands, CEMEX lands, and private lands, as well as on the US side on NPS lands, state lands, and CEMEX lands. And so it allows the monitoring dollars to go a lot further than I think in the case of having multiple teams and associated with specific jurisdictions. Establish a legacy fund. Easier said than done, but man, if you could do it, that is, I think, one of the ways to really have kind of a pot of funding that allows support to go in the long term beyond the life of an immediate grant. And I'll go to number 7 too, right here, is that there's sort of two parts of it. One, you can establish it, and it takes something to establish it. But it's also, you have to, of course, fund a legacy fund. And one of the ways, or two ways, that we have found in our experience, and that were from some of the suggestions for this particular list of long-term funding ideas, is there's two ideas that came out. One is to use crumbs from multiple project budgets, because you always ends up, not always. I mean, a lot of times you you spend your project budgets down to zero or even negative. But sometimes you just end up with a few funds, and being able to essentially get rid of those or zero them out, but then transfer those crumbs into it's kind of a legacy fund that sort of becomes long term. And if you have multiple project budgets from multiple entities, that could add up to some good funding. And the other part too that we have found that's been really helpful is to allow mechanisms where multiple agencies and foundations, organizations that are working in your region where you are implementing stream restoration to contribute to that legacy fund. And so in the case of, again, in the case of the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo, for example, we established a legacy fund. It was informal. And we don't need to get into the reason why, but there was some, just internationally, legally, it was really kind of difficult, but informally, this allowed us to use extra funding or funding from different grants from CONAP, from Big Bend National Park, Texas, foundations and other organizations, and establish a legacy monitoring fund that we use to this day on long-term funding. So, not enough, but it seems to be enough, but it does certainly help. Has helped. So those quick list and for funding, and look forward to hearing some ideas from you all in the audience and others on the panel, and any other questions on any of the presentations that you all have. So thank you. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Ben. Back to you.
Well, thanks, Mark. Like I said, we were going to try to cram a lot into a short time, and we've already gone 10 minutes over, so I will officially call the end of the conference and thank all of you for participating throughout the whole day, but we'll leave this room open for discussion, so feel free to unmute yourselves, unmute your video if you want, and chat, about anything we talked about for the last 2.5 hours.
I had one quick comment to follow up on Mark's legacy fund idea, and that's there are often challenges. A lot of the contracts for mitigation or restoration projects only cover a few years of implementation and post-implementation monitoring. So that obviously leads to this challenge of what do you do in the future, and also working at a small site scale. There are limits to what you can do with your data in terms of statistical power and other things. So one of the things we've tried to do is by using standardized methods across projects, it enables you to go back later and do more of this meta-analysis and potentially come up with more powerful conclusions about what works and what doesn't, and take it from there. So that's just another concept along the lines of what Mark was suggesting.
I have a question in general about plans for RiversEdge West and Tamarisk leaf beetle monitoring this year along the Gila. Are you guys going to be out there? Maybe Matt or Ben?
Yeah, I'm going to be out there, Kara. We're trying to figure out the funding, but Ben does have a little funding for us to at least get out to some of these areas, and Gila is a priority. Also, the Verde is another priority since the beetle entered that area.
Okay.
And then we're going to continue to look at these sites, such as the Salt and the Tonto, which haven't been infiltrated yet, but we want to look at those sites and possibly the lower Colorado. But yeah, I mean, it's not going to be the intensity that we had, and last year was such a weird year that a lot of these sites, the beetles were so low in numbers, it was hard to find them. But yeah, we're definitely going to be on the Gila again.
Okay, great. Do you plan on doing anything along the San Francisco?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We're there. Yeah, see where that distribution is, and I'm sure they'll be in the main stem this year. You're gonna, I think, see some dramatic changes. I'd really like to get in there and look at flycatchers since I've got all this sweet data before the beetle, and Melanie has reached out to them about that, about APHIS, but right now it doesn't sound like they're going to fund anything. So.
Gotcha. Well, I can potentially help augment that. So maybe let's have a conversation. I have the protocols, and I'd like to. I have a little bit of funding to maybe get a volunteer corps, maybe some citizen scientists to help us out. So maybe we can talk about that offline.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, let's. The sooner the better, so we can set something up. If you do have a little funding, and we can figure out some way to at least get something done.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send you an email.
Okay, great. Mark, you said something about Walton funding. Is there something about Waltons are going to contribute some new funding? Are they looking for new projects or?
That I don't know, Matt. They established a legacy fund for some of the watershed groups that they worked with in this region and other regions as well. That is being set up for maintenance and monitoring, mostly associated with their restoration activities.
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, so that's what that mainly is right now. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's great that they did it. And I'm not sure, I haven't heard from Peter yet as to, what their potential next chapter is, as they kind of pivot a little bit from their past funding to future.
Yeah.
I got some guesses, but
yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're still going. We're still going.
Hey, Matt, it's Chris.
Hey, Chris.
It's going. APHIS, I guess that's just not really happening.
Yeah. So what we've heard, and Ben's been in touch with them too, and I have also, that they due to the pandemic, their funding is gone because they get some money from imports and from taxes. But we did hear there's a possibility that they're shifting this whole conservation of willow flycatchers, this program and their lawsuit to the biocontrol budget, which makes sense. So they are, and Kai said that's in the process, and if that's the case, there might be like allocated funding, but it's a guessing game of what's going on. And
yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm not an attorney, and I think at some point they would have to perform to whatever damages are seen. But it's a real bummer out here with our remote sensing study was we didn't get funding for that, for flycatcher habitat impacts to Tamarisk that you were involved in.
Yeah.
Back in 2017 when we started. That was a 3-year remote sensing data set when we were looking at flycatcher territories, but even the monitoring with presence absence surveys, the big data gap from last year. And then I just don't, we have some surveys here at our office, and I assume Bureau will be down there too. To what extent, I don't know.
Yeah, I know that Dave's funding with the Bureau has been cut quite a bit too.
Okay.
So yeah, I know he'll be back in that area. Right now, we are not going to be back in the Rio Grande. We have, we're just trying to finish all this genetic study that we've been doing on the Rio Grande, and then we expanded that genetic part of it to the whole area. So they're analyzing that data now. But yeah, that was all funded with APHIS from last year, and now I don't know. Ben may have some new information or no.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a real bummer with the flycatcher because we have a series of disturbances, whether it's drought or now fire. There was another fire south in Socorro County, south of the Tiffany site.
Wow.
The pool elevation that wiped out another big swath of habitat last summer. So yeah, it's interesting down here.
Yeah, I mean, the combination of the beetle and the drought and all these questions that are popping up now. I memean, it'd be great to continue this, and where they're coming into the Gila and into the San Francisco. I mean, the question. This is the time not to stop monitoring.
Yeah, for sure, indeed.
That's been a real drag.
Hey, Matt, I had a question for you on the yellow-billed cuckoo. There's been a couple of places that we have seen or heard. Actually, there's been some surveys done that have found the yellow-billed cuckoo nesting in mesquite. And I was wondering if that's I'm no expert on the yellow-billed cuckoo or birds for that matter. And I was just curious if that's common. And I was kind of surprised to hear it. And from a conservation standpoint, it would be a positive thing, I would think, as obligate riparian trees like the cottonwoods and willows blink out. And if mesquite communities are able to withstand, climate change and drying of rivers and that kind of thing, that might bode well for the cuckoo. But I just want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, there's been records of them nesting in mesquite, but they mainly use that adjacent habitat and that's what's so important about that mesquite habitat with the cuckoo, that they use it for foraging. The cicadas are in along the river's edge in the cottonwood and willow, but they really are in that mesquite, and they'll nest mainly in for that cover where the cottonwood and willow is, but then they expand out into those areas for foraging, and they really like those big bugs, cicadas, heads, and so because they really have to feed their young a lot of food in a very short period of time. And so when the cicada breakouts occur, that's why they're in the mesquite. But we have found there's a few records of them actually nesting out there too.
Yeah, it was along the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo that they were nesting in mesquite. It was cool.
Wow, yeah, the mesquite has huge value for that bird because their home range and territories are so big. And they need that floodplain, so yeah. Yeah, that big old mesquite, like on the San Pedro, if you're familiar with that, they really like that. It does have that tall canopy, and they actually have some cover.
Cool, thanks.
I think we lost Ben.
I think some of that mesquite discussion got brought out of context in the delisting effort for the cuckoo.
Oh yeah.
You're familiar with that, Matt? Yeah.
That definitely was brought up, and we've really emphasized it. We've really shown on the Verde in some of our sites that if the area was occupied, it had that adjacent mesquite, and even on the lower Colorado too.
Yeah.
They gave overemphasis to the nesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have you seen those? I think there's one or two papers about the cuckoo saying that, some irrigation in Mexico might be intercepting some of the migrating birds, and they're using habitat adjacent to some of those ag fields in Jalisco. And
oh, really?
Yeah. It's only one paper though, so I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's elusive. Elusive.
Oh,
bird.
it is. It is. Way elusive, man. Yeah, and like the willow flycatcher, their numbers they are going down. There's some of these sites are blinking out, and with the willow flycatcher, yeah, the kern is a perfect example where they're just completely gone. They haven't been in those sites at all.
Yeah, that's the real interesting thing. Here in Albuquerque, the Corps funded all this restoration, and the last year before last, 2019, they had a late season migrant. It was real weird because it was towards the nesting season that it would be in there, and that was not followed up on. So all this money got spent on, that, but we still are unknown in terms of like if it's being utilized. And that was one of the only detections late in the season.
Yeah.
Duration. Yeah.
Well, cool, Mark. Is there some follow up on this as far as monitoring is concerned? I hope we're not going to stop with this, because we did do this last fall, but this monitoring, somehow we need to continue this discussion, and I'm not sure how we go about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, Matt. It's really worthy continuing the discussion about. In fact, you're the one, I think, I just remember you at the very end of the APHIS workshop talking about monitoring, and the funding for monitoring specifically, and which led us to this, I think, in part. So I think we just need to put our heads together and figure out how to keep it going. We need to find a solution.
Yeah, I know. And even with these long-term funding sources, such as the Park Service with the networks, and that money's starting to disappear, there's got to, I hope with this administration, there's some emphasis that, there's got to be this established long-term monitoring, like that multi-species program down in the lower Colorado.
Right.
And it's a 50-year program with $650 million. And that money was allocated, to that. So there's got to be, we got to figure that out.
I don't know if maybe Chris, you know this, but there was a long-term fund associated with the Corps of Engineers at some point. It's called associated with the Rio Grande. I think it was called I can't remember the name of the source. They talked about it for years, and there was all kinds of sharks circling and allocations and discussion. There was a lot of money. I'm not sure if it ever got funded. It was called the Rio Grande Restoration Fund or something like that.
Yeah, there's been a few of those that have come through. There's the big Army Corps funded restoration monitoring and like collaborative program that they hired a contractor to even do all of the program implementation for getting all of like the endangered species folks to kind of talk together. And that's ongoing, but it's not funded by the Corps anymore. I really don't know where it's still going on. Andrea, my boss, would know more about that. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Andrea said, she kind of mentioned that maybe that program is going to be re-implemented because, they lost all their funding, but she wasn't sure at the time. This was a couple of months ago, but the Army Corps has been very valuable in a lot of the work that Chris and Tetra Tech does and what I've done on there. And they got all that funding pulled like last year and the year before. And so with this new administration, she thought maybe there's going to be a startup again because their whole ecological program kind of got cut.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. To go to the wall, to be frank with you. It's horrible, but it's frustrating. You'd think that there could be a permanent funding, there's like this 1% for the arts, or, it's like this very small tax. And if there could be something like that for these novel ecosystems that are heavily modified, that need, almost constant maintenance and monitoring, would be really good.
Talk to your senator.
Yeah, or something. We've been looking more at the Land and Water Conservation Fund, though.
Exactly.
Even though that seems to fund more just like making a park or something, but not like restoration. So I don't know. We'll see what comes.
Any potential use of gambling funding from casino?
Yeah.
No, seriously. I mean, there's a lot of money out there, and they do have pots of money, associated with natural resource type stuff. But I've never been able to capitalize on it.
No.
Yeah. I think a challenge, California with our regulatory environment, it's the longer term monitoring collaborative efforts are, focused around water districts that have, huge regulatory requirements and a lot more financial incentive to, commit to longer term plans. And it seems like as you move out of California, the politics change, the funding level changes, and it just gets to be more challenging. So
Yeah.
maybe the casinos are the way to go.
Well, regardless, Matt, going back to your question, I think, at least the folks here on this panel, we should do a debrief at some point and try to keep this going.
Yeah, I